Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today I'm honoured to be speaking with Dr Pippa Grange. Pippa, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you for having me, Dan. It's great to be here.
Wow, I'm super honoured and really excited to have you on the show. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Okay, well, my name's Pippa and I am I call myself a culture coach rather than a performance psych, and no doubt we'll get into that through the podcast and the chat. But I grew up in Yorkshire and I went to Loughborough University as an undergrad, and moved to Australia when I was 25 and had 20 years there. A lot of my sports career has been there. My doctoral studies were there. Absolutely loved it. And then had a couple of years in LA with my husband, Abdullah, and our two dogs. And I am now, came back to England, the great return to England 3 years ago to work with the FA and obviously to be a little bit closer to family as well. So I'm back and I'm now working with a group called Right to Dream as their head of cultural strategy. So 25 years in the field, lots of it's given me lots of rewards and lots of memorable journeys I've been on. So yeah, thank you for having me again.
And you've written a book in 2020, Fearless: How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. And that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm sure we're going to litter our conversation with sporting examples and anecdotes. But I was really excited to pick this book up. I've been reading it over the past week and have just enormously enjoyed it and found myself head nodding in so many places, Pippa. So it's been awesome. It's an awesome read. And let's just start about the genesis of this book. Why a book about fear? Where does the sort of the title stem from? What made you go down this path of writing this particular book?
Yeah, over that period of work, 25 years of work, I started working one-on-one with individuals in a sort of an off-pitch sense, a non-performance sense. So working with athletes about how they were traveling through their athletic journey. It might have been the stuff of life like relationships or drugs and alcohol, or sometimes injury transitions and gambling problems and all sorts of stuff. So I worked one-on-one, and then I worked more with teams and organizations, and I worked with comedians and journalists and CEOs and business leaders and all of these people who, on the surface, it looked like, to anybody else looking in, they looked like they were utterly composed. They were utterly fulfilled and happy with life. But the reality that I heard with sort of alarming regularity was that under the surface, whatever the trappings of success were, there was this hungriness or hunger, I should say, or a lack of fulfillment that was the source of which was the fear of not being good enough. So I saw many, many times the pattern of whatever was in the trophy cabinet, there was a lack of fulfillment, a lack of the ability to experience the joy of their success, to really feel that they had achieved something that made them worthy in their own minds. So I just saw this repeat pattern of not good enough fear. And of course, in the work of a performance psychologist anyway, you do lots of work on what I call in the moment fear and, managing anxiety for performance. That's like a bread and butter piece of what we do, of course. But there was this underbelly always in this sort of not good enough fear that lay behind. And so I just thought it was just such a compelling pattern to explore. And then the opportunity to work with the England football team, where they had this sort of theatre of doom 2016 Euros experience. And, when I was considering the job and reading going back and reading about this team and the commentary in the media about this team, I was like, wow, because I'd been out of the country for a while. I hadn't followed so closely. So like, wow, there is a lot of fear talk in here. There is a lot of shame. There is a lot of, really, really deep sort of emotional content in what's happening around this team, what's being thrown in at this team, and I wondered if this was going to be a good fit. So then after the World Cup, I had the opportunity to sort of bring the two things together and to write about it. And I thought, I hoped it might be a good resource for people, both people who were experiencing this in their own lives, just, everyday people, but also for professionals and for anybody else in leadership roles who are thinking about how, where does their emotion and their behavior stem from? What's the root of it that they really ought, if they're going to put their precious energy to work on something, what is it that they should work on? So that was really the genesis of it. And, you go through many iterations as you write. And I knew that I wanted to write about kind of rehumaning sport and keeping the soul in sport and in life a lot more and being a bit less robotic. So the two got to merge. So hopefully that's how it reads when you pick it up.
Well, you've written this in 4 parts, and what I'd like to do today is go through each part and build a bit of a story here. I mean, part 1 is entitled "Fear Isn't Just in Your Head and You're Not Alone." Fear isn't just in your head and you're not alone. And I think that's it's a fascinating title to part 1, because I think we can all be guilty of thinking that fear is just in our head. But what do you mean by that it's not just in your head? What are you actually trying to tell us there?
What I want to explore in that section is the fact that our cultures hold, recycle, embody, and express so much fear. So, as you said, we tend to think of it as an internal phenomena only, but it's very contagious. If you walk into a room where there is a fear tension, a fear energy, you feel that very quickly, and then we move, we change our behavior accordingly. We adapt. We're very adaptable as a species, and so fear cultures. Even if you really know that it's just that one person over there that's causing this sort of sense of fear, there may be a whole realm of behavior shift in and around that group based on that one person and their fear-based behaviors. So, it's actually quite readily recycled. And I also wanted to kind of illuminate so much of the language. We talk in our language, we talk in scarcity terms rather than abundance terms all the time. We treat life as a battle. It just even in our narratives, it's a scrap to get something done. It's a fight out there. It's a jungle out there. It's, in sport, we do it all the time. Did we nail it? Did we smash it? Did we kill it? Did we, dominate? Did we conquer? And there's a difference between competition and, the kind of dominance needed on the field of play to win, and that as a narrative for life. So I wanted to point out that we have a really strong, hyper-competitive, hyper-individual dominance and scarcity narrative that runs our lives unless we're deliberate about not allowing that. And then finally, just the drip feed of fear in our culture through media. So, there's no better time than the moment, 2020, to sort of illuminate that. But there's, if you listen to the news, if you do a little thought experiment, listen to the news for an hour and pick out how many fear-based narratives or fear-based comments there are in there that inspire fear in us, but they're coming in at us. So not a random thing that just happens in your mind, in your own skin. It's generated between us and culturally constantly.
I think that idea of a scarcity mentality, language driving a scarcity mentality. You mentioned in the book the perception of not enough winning to go around. A couple of minutes ago, you talked about a fear culture, that holding on to our fears over the years and then expressing itself. There's only so much you can talk about in terms of your experiences with the England team, but when you stepped into that role, I know you've talked about when I've listened to you in the past talking about the walls talking. What would the walls say about our mindset, our language, what we're doing, our behaviours? Did you find that there was a bit of a scarcity mentality in and around that England's team or setup at the time?
I have found that in almost every team I've walked into.
Yeah.
It's a rare team that is, already feeling very relaxed about their sort of moment in the sun and not feeling like their window's about to close. They have to make it happen this year, or it's this cycle. And sport gives us many reasons that that's a reality in terms of competition cycles, etc., and talent and all the rest of it. But it's very rare where a team has actually worked through the process of eliminating the scarcity mentality fully. Or in my experience anyway. So, that's not just England, that's been almost every team, some sort of doubt kicking around the corner that they don't really think that they're in as good shape as they could be, and they may miss out. They may lose something, even if they're at the top.
How much pushback can you get when you start talking about this scarcity mentality? Because it feels like when you operate in these environments and these organizations are in essence created to win, created around results, then there must be, when you start these conversations with head coaches, with managers, with key stakeholders, is there much pushback here? Yeah, but Pippa, this is all very nice, but look, we're here to win. There's only one person who can win the league title. There's only one team that can win the World Cup. That's our reality, and we've just got to play through that reality. What kind of conversations evolve when you get a bit of pushback there?
I think the first thing to say is it's really important to meet people where they are and start there. So, when people have put a whole body of work into creating the systems that win, you need to approach them at that level. So where I would start with it is to say, is this helpful to you? Does this move you forward? Here are the narratives I'm hearing. What do you believe around how they help you or how they hinder you? Let's talk about that. And then be able to bring into those conversations perhaps some perspectives that people haven't thought about the downsides of scarcity mentality, such as avoiding risks, avoiding being exposed. If you're fighting for your place on the team, you're not fighting to win. There is a whole way that you can actually illuminate, is probably the better word. You can illuminate the downsides of some of the scarcity narratives that might be playing out. And the question then becomes, it's not a telling, it's a question of what is the most useful thing we can do within the time frame to get to the win? What mentality will work best? What have we seen before? And to debunk some of the myths, because some of the myths that are welded on are the conquest myths and, dog eat dog. It's, be nasty out there kind of thing. And, the way I approach that is really relevant in small moments in the game. But if that is your whole life mentality, your team mentality, and your whole every game mentality, you've got no flex in there. And that's exhausting mentally. That there's no renewal of your psychological capacity or psychological energy in that mentality. It's a constant scrap, literally. So, I don't feel that that's optimal for performance. So I talk about it on those levels, and I make sure that I start there rather than, the assumption that, well, all that sounds nice, but we're not here to be nice. We're here to win. It's like, yeah, let's talk about winning. Let's start with talking about winning. I don't think these things will get you to the win, or you might get the first half, or you might get 2 games. But, is this really what's going, if you're operating on fear and scarcity, what's in the loss column? And, then when you can get those conversations going, you can say, so what's the gap? What do we need to do if we did it differently? Where are our skill gaps? Where are our narrative gaps? What kind of things will help us step over that hurdle so that we can do something much stronger and more enduring?
Fear and scarcity isn't sustainable, is what I'm hearing you say.
Well, not without a massive burnout cost, and probably, a serious percentage of your team who aren't sort of the hardened warrior types, being willing to expose themselves fully. And what I mean by that is, to really take the kind of small in the moment risks that they need to show flair, or to bring confidence, take a shot from somewhere that they, they may otherwise think, well, I'll pass the ball here. So it's those elements that, you need to paint a picture of what's the restriction and the gain of fear and scarcity, and what's the restriction and the gain of the alternative, which is, much more sort of good enough, confident, abundant, free, enjoying it, hungry, leave nothing out there. Because I think also when we talk about fear and scarcity, people think the alternative is kind of fluffy and lovely. So you have to paint the picture that it's like, no, it's still got all the blood, sweat and tears in it. It just doesn't have the negativity in it. It just doesn't have the draining sort of, exhausting, bone-shaking negativity in it that fear and scarcity do. So you've still got loads of grit and loads of resilience and loads of good fight, but you don't have, it's not laced in the same way with the sort of heaviness of fear.
Well, you lay out in this part what happens in a fear culture. You mention how it can spoil fun, it can keep you small, it can betray your trust, it can restrict your mental freedom, and so on and so forth. And it feels like, as you're describing there, it starts with your belief about success. You mentioned the word myth. You talk about the myths of losing turns you into a loser. Fear is the best motivator. Only the fittest survive. You really try to break down these myths. And let's come back to this notion of that stickiness of culture, that stickiness of fear within culture, language. This is the Sports Psych show, so we're really talking about sport here, but obviously the book is generic. But within sport almost comes burdened with the definition, doesn't it? Especially competitive sport. You talk about the myth of fear is the best motivator, and that is a myth, that it can motivate. You mentioned that, hey, look, it can motivate. But in actual fact, it's not the best motivator, because this depletes you of energy. It depletes you of your resources. So in this part, you're really trying to, I suppose, debunk and demystify, break down self-limiting beliefs, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And also file them into, if you take the example of fear being not being the myth that fear is a great motivator. Fear is a great motivator in the moment when you need to change your behavior and do something drastic. If you're driving into a corner too fast, and you get a adrenaline prickle of fear running right up your body, you make an adjustment, and it's a good thing. We wouldn't want to be without fear, which is why the book's called Fearless rather than Fearless. But it's, my challenge is this a good way of life? Is this a good way of practice in sport? Because when it's and also when it's the fear of not being good enough, I don't see a whole heap of benefit that can't be achieved better with alternatives, that enrich the person, that drive them way beyond what they thought they were capable of, because they feel, they're not running away from something, they're running towards it, and there's just an enormous difference in there. But, one of the ways I do that, when I can identify the difference between the two things, and say, fear is fear a good motivator or not? And say, well, in the moment, here's where it works. Here's where it really drains. Here's where it doesn't. And I might give some case examples. So I one of the things I'm very used to doing in teams is giving case examples from different sports. I might bring in something from Tour de France, or I might use something from cricket or rugby or basketball, and different coaches or different players or different scenarios, and give examples of where a fear motivation has really worked. At halftime in a captain's Tom Brady talk to the team that's like we can, and scarcity language. We have got no time to lose. That's a little bit of scarcity language. Okay, it works there. It's a lift. It's a motivator. Where it doesn't work, I'll give another example to a team of where you can see players moving away from like a really bruising halftime chat where people have been shamed and, your job's on the line, or, we'll never recover from this if you don't do what you're supposed to do in the second half, kind of thing. And you can see the players' body language and you can see the results. And of course, it's not always a completely foolproof 100%, equation, is it, that it always goes that way? But I think the more you can make a compelling argument that there is more value in doing it differently, and maybe the thing we have to put energy into is what will that take? What do we need to be good at to do it differently? Then sports goal oriented. People in sport are goal oriented. Give them something to do, to work on, that feels compelling and that is backed up by rational logic.
Listening to you there, I'm thinking of the word nuance, that there might be a time where you use fear as a motivator, essentially, but probably a micro moment in time, if you like, where something might work. But we've always got to have our finger on the pulse of the organisation, the team, in terms of fear as a de-energizer. And you mentioned there that, look, hey, come on, fear is a good thing, right? And that's a neat segue onto part 2, where it's entitled "Be Prepared to Be Scared." And you open up here by saying, look, fear is natural and fear is central to the human experience. And you give us a little bit of a neurological underpinnings here. Fear is natural, isn't it? It is central to the human experience.
Mm-hmm. Our fear systems, I describe it very sort of simplistically in the book, of like the old circuitry and the new circuitry, old circuitry including amygdala and the vast unconscious, and new circuitry being prefrontal cortex, etc., and all of our languaging skills and rationality. What I'm talking about there with the sort of systems being developed is before we're even born, before 9 months gestation, our fear system is fully evolved in a human child, a human infant. It takes us till we're about 2 years old to be able to really develop some of the other sort of nuancing skills or ability to discern how to respond to language, how to use other means of assessing our environments and information. So the first thing we learn before anything else is fear. That we need to survive, that there is a risk that we are not going to be looked after, and we have to respond to that straight away. So it's very natural, very embedded in us. We're one of the most vulnerable mammals on the planet. We need care from our caregivers for the longest time before we can stand and feed ourselves or anything else. So this is not only inherent and naturally built into us. It's very, very sort of strong in our makeup, and which is why I say we have to actually. It won't. Fear stimuluses will go away, but we actually have to learn the skills to deal with fear, both at the in the moment level and the not good enough level, because that won't happen naturally. It's not an organic development process. We have to actually take charge of that to be able to put it in the right place, have it at the right size in our lives, and not take up all the space.
Well, you've mentioned a few times now, in the moment fear and not good enough fear. And in a way, this sets the tone for the rest of the book. It feels like the rest of the book is very much about building the capacity to deal with in the moment fear and not good enough fear, to take charge of these essentially. And I think I read in there that you suggest that we can't necessarily control these, but we can certainly respond to these. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Well, in the moment fear, you can't control the stimulus that comes at you, but you can actually get very good at not being moved or fazed by that. You get very adaptive and very quick to respond positively and to stay in the zone of composure for you. So that is very manageable. Not good enough fear is also something that we can go a whole way forward to in managing in ourselves. The distinction I make is that in the moment fear can be managed with sort of techniques, and not good enough fear is not something we deal with techniques. My point in the book is that we have to do a deeper dive on this stuff, and it's so important for me to say that, because I refuse to sell anyone a dummy that we, that's quick fix stuff. We do, we're as humans, we're built by layers of experience, and we're built by life in many ways. And I feel that it's important to say this stuff's not going to be fixed by next week if you have some deep, not good enough fears. But here's some ideas, here's some thoughts, and a pathway forward to start that journey.
Well, I think that's fascinating. So in the moment fear and not good enough fear, and tools and techniques are revolving around in the moment fear, which we'll talk about in a second, because you suggest some in the book, and then more of a narrative around not good enough fear. I suppose one question before we cover some of the techniques in terms of being able to boss in the moment fear, as you describe it in one of the chapters. Have you found in your work that the day-to-day narrative, the inner stories that players have, influence the fear that they might experience on the pitch or the court or the course?
100%. Yeah. It's, the inner stories are probably the primary influence of that. So, if somebody is on the pitch or court or the course and they're thinking, I'm not just talking at the self-talk level. That's like the way that it repeatedly gets expressed to the individual. But if they have a deep personal narrative or archetype of themselves, that they are the underdog, they are probably shouldn't be there in the first place. They're the wild card. They got the lucky break. And there is some sense of undeservedness in that. That can be a huge narrative around, somebody's success on the field of performance. So I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, I suppose in my work, Pippa, one, as a sports psychologist, roams the corridors and strives to find good conversations and listen in, and having been embedded into medical departments and listening to some of the conversations that players have, it's always fascinating. And I found myself one day talking to a player and just making this comment, and it was, we're at a time when Liverpool are flying high in the English Premier League, so we're talking soccer here, and I found myself saying, Liverpool are Liverpool in part because they've got great players and they've got a great manager and everything's fantastic at the moment. But also Liverpool are Liverpool because the opposition perceives them to be Liverpool. Because the narrative one creates around Liverpool. They're amazing, they've got these great players, they're beating everybody, they're the best in the world. The narrative we create on a day-to-day basis fuels an in-the-moment fear that can cripple us, and it becomes very difficult to boss that in-the-moment fear when Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, going into that Saturday game against Liverpool, means that, we feel suppressed. We feel they're going to be too good. Does something like that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's the All Blacks story, isn't it? Can anybody really beat the All Blacks consistently? And facing Serena Williams, that kind of the narrative that goes with that. But, that's from a sports psych perspective for us, that's like, well, what's your, how are you building the foundations for your own story to bring into that at least as strong as, well, it should be stronger than the one that you're perceiving in the other person. But I think that there are some small nuances as well that we can do with that. Take the All Blacks story or the Serena Williams, they're well and truly earned, but to change that idea of like, I'm not good enough against that opponent to how I'm strong and confident in my own performance, but also how amazing I get to play against. So I think that there are some ways that we shift that to challenge, like the brilliance of a genuine challenge mindset, and like come back to what is sport. I get to test my mettle against the best in the world. I bring all of my play, all of my possibility, and just see how it goes here. It's only when we get down to that scarcity and to that very narrowed view of sport and performance that it's only about winning in the narrow sense of the scoreboard, rather than the broader sense of character and endeavor and test and competition, that we lose that enjoyment. So if you're in a position that you're playing against Serena Williams, how have you built your own strong tower of confidence and self-identity? But then how are you, grateful for that opportunity to just see where you're at, to bring your best? And if there's no shame kicking around in the background, that's so much easier to achieve. If there's no sense of not being good enough, or if you didn't win, that you would somehow be worth less as a person or as an athlete, then you would have a different mindset approaching that contest. So here's how the two things interact for me. That's why I think it's so important that we look at in the moment fear and not good enough fear, so that you can build that strong tower for yourself as the athlete or the team. But you can also have an attitude of like, I'm going to love this. This is, how unbelievable that I get the chance, and I think we'll see some great examples of that. And of course, athletes are human, so they have all sorts of emotions and very bad days. Like, Djokovic lately kind of, is a sort of anathema to normal behavior for him. And, everybody has a rough day. And I think we have to remember that too. And everybody has a moment where the volume on the fear is turned up too much. But, my point is, you can come back to, you can get your four corners of your feet back on the ground and come back to these principles of like, who are you in your identity when you compete, and how are you good enough to even, I don't mean how are you proving you're good enough, but how do you know you're good enough as a human being to go out there and see what you've got in competition.
The word coming through to me there is meaning. What I love about what you're saying is you're shifting a narrative to change the meaning. And it feels like you're saying that with relation to developing this challenge state. So on the Sports Site show, we've talked with various people about developing, say, a challenge state rather than a threat state. which from a scientific perspective is underpinned by self-efficacy, so self-belief or self-confidence, by perception of control. I feel I'm in control, having an approach focus, focusing on what I want. And all those three things, so that's the science, right, isn't it, Pippa? But those three things feel like they can be influenced by meaning. And as you mentioned there, hey, I'm excited. That approach focus, focusing on what we want rather than what we don't want. Oh, I don't want to be beaten by Liverpool. They're so good. Approach focus on me and what I can do, as you've mentioned there, underpinned by meaning. I'm excited to go out there and do what I can do and express myself and show what I can do. The building blocks, you mentioned building blocks of confidence, self-efficacy, self-belief. Again, meaning, changing the meaning, changing the story.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of where we started in sport. It's where it's coming back to that and recognizing that sometimes we've got way too narrow in our meaning, to sort of just the trophy, just the win, just the tally, rather than the whole experience of sport. And that for me, when you asked me what was the journey to writing this book, that for me was what I saw so many times, of that emptiness or that hunger in people, of like they didn't, because their meaning was so narrow, rather than it be a life endeavor, to find the very, very best you have in your bones, to leave out there in competition. I'm a big fan of competition. I'm not suggesting when I talk about the problem with conquest mentality or the problem with scarcity mentality, I'm not for a second saying competition's a problem. I'm saying the attitude about why you compete and who you are while you do is everything.
Well, interestingly, on that basis, just briefly heading back to part one, you talk about the difference between winning deep and winning shallow. You differentiate there. So competition exists, and as you mentioned, that's a great thing. That's always going to be part of the equation. It's always going to be a part of sport. Fine, but there's a difference between winning deep and winning shallow, and that deeper sense of winning potentially leads to greater longevity and just more joy and more positive psychological outcomes, essentially.
Yeah, and enduring. So it's I always think of I really enjoy the Golden State Warriors under Steve Kerr, and I think about a couple of their values of joy and compassion, and these are like, nobody could question the Golden State Warriors on court performance as a team over the last years. They've been extraordinary in their winning streak, but that has come from a high resilience, high effort, high bonding and environment with really solid understanding of joy, compassion, and purpose and meaning for them. So I think that there's, as with all of this, I think that the task for us as sports psychs or culture coaches is to be able to describe and illuminate the path to what could be stronger than this sort of dogged, rusted on mentality of conquest and dominance and, must beat the other or you are a loser. What could be stronger than that? It's not an alternative to be less, it's an alternative to be more.
Briefly, removing ourselves from narrative, because I know there will be a lot of people listening in and saying, this is fantastic and this is awesome, but I also know that Dr. Pippa Grange will have worked individually with players over the years to help them boss the in-the-moment fear. We can get our narrative fantastic, we can change our meaning, we can expand it, but human beings are human beings, and as you mentioned, we're going to sometimes be susceptible to that fear on the pitch and on the course or on the court, and the reality is, within competition, we do need to be able to manage ourselves. When we're having uncomfortable conversations, we do need to be able to manage ourselves, and so on and so forth. You introduce the audience to three main approaches, three alternatives, actually. Process it, distract from it, rationalize it. Just for a couple of minutes, would you like to take us through those three approaches?
Yeah, and for the sports psychs in your audience, and for you too, these are very sort of familiar ideas. But when I wrote this book, I particularly wanted to use language that was really accessible and non-jargon, so that people could just come at it and have an idea of like, well, what can I even do if I'm terrified about taking my driving test or a free throw? Where do I start? So I bucketed them into these three sort of main umbrella concepts. Process it is the stuff that we would talk about. That would be any anxiety management technique. The ones I give examples of in the book include, breath work and guided meditation or guided relaxation, mantras, etc. Any kind of work where a person is able to go back to a pre-worked routine, ideally. If they're an athlete, that's part of their toolbox. They know what they're doing with that. And they can use something established to bring themselves back to the moment. That's what I mean by processing it. Okay, fear's here. What do I do with it? And they might, go back through a routine. And that processing might look like that from the night before a game, or a performance, or the day before, or the week before, or it might be right there in the moment. So that's what I mean by the processing stuff. Distraction is more. Even though I mention in the book you can use, I've known many athletes who use one or more at different times, or use a couple, integrated, and that's totally fine too, as long as you know what you're doing and you repeat it. So the distraction, I've worked with a number of athletes who they just basically want to clown around and have a laugh to release the tension before a football game, for example, or they need headphones on, in their little corner of the change room, and they want to distract with music or a podcast or something else. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to process it. They just want to be somewhere else until the moment's there, and that's totally fine too. So, that's what I mean by distraction. And then sort of, rationalize it is kind of, what it says on the tin in a way. It's how do you bring logic back where you've been struck by emotion? If you're in a fear state, or, you can feel that coming, how do you bring logic and rationality back into that situation? What do you come back to in fact, evidence? And, there's a few sort of examples I give throughout the book of how you can actually do that, to check in on yourself factually about where things are at, to present evidence to yourself of what situation you're actually in. Because when fear strikes, obviously you're emotionally much less controlled, and much more insular in your thinking. So rationality is a big tool in the middle of that too. So they're the kind of umbrellas.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask you here. I mean, England got to the semi-final. England football soccer team got to the semi-final of the World Cup in 2018. To all intents and purposes, it was a very successful campaign, and a lot of what we're talking about today, you would have worked alongside Gareth Southgate, the England head coach, and the coaching staff and the key stakeholders and everyone around the team. Look, clearly, Pippa, you're not going to name names. That's not what this is about. But in terms of bossing in the moment fear, did you do much of that? Was there a need to do much of that? Or really was it just the environmental, the cultural piece that really took precedence? Did you do much individual work?
There's bits and pieces individually, and some group stuff. But really, one of the things that in international, when you work at international level, you have so little time that's player facing in camp schedules, as any psych would know that does that. And for me, I use a method called working through, which means I need to make sure that the coaches and the frontline staff are really clear on how this stuff works, so they're doing it in the right there at the coalface kind of thing. So working through, whether it's on fear or anything else, working through is about ensuring that the cohort who are closest to the athletes at all times really understand how this stuff comes out in what they say, how they behave, how they can soothe it, how they can respond. So that's the bigger piece. The kind of expert at the front of the room piece is a very small sliver. And then one-on-one stuff, is peppered around as needed in relation to that. People look at something like a turnaround event, a turnaround moment in sport, and they assume that massive amounts of technical work has been done on the specific sports psychology of individuals. Whereas I that's not my experience anyway. My experience has been that the big bulk of work is done culturally, and then there are smaller sections that are technical around this. In camps anyway, a lot of elite players or pro players now do their work outside of camp or outside of club, because they feel that that's where they've got the space, the psychological space to do that work.
Absolutely. Moving on to part 3, when fear gets distorted, and very much emphasizing not good enough fears here. You start to talk about fear playing out in your life in a less than obvious way. What do you mean by that? Can you fill us in on what you mean by that?
Yeah, what I'm talking about really is, I call it distorted fear. And, it's the idea that fear is at the root of other kinds of emotional expression, and we might not recognize them as fear. So things like jealousy, perfectionism, being the critic or to self or other, and sort of this overt need to stay separate, which might include staying separate and superior. So it manifests in different expressions, but actually the root of those things is fear. So, in that section, I'm talking about, how fear distorts and is kind of sneaky. It wears a mask and it shows up in different ways. But if you actually dig deep enough, that's the thing to work on. That's the source material for what somebody's experiencing.
So sometimes we might engage in behaviours that at first glance might not appear to be related to fear, or fear might not be perceived to be at the heart of those behaviours or driving those behaviours. But what you're saying is actually fear is quite sneaky, and it can absolutely be related to fear.
Definitely. It's how many times have we heard, oh, that guy's just really got a huge ego, or he's just so arrogant, or who does he think he is, kind of thing, and it's a superiority. And whenever I hear that, my radar goes up to, I wonder what sits underneath there, because there may be a fear source underneath that, sort of what other people perceive as a superiority or an arrogance, or an aloofness. If somebody's just like, wow, we can't get through to that person. She's never open, she's never available emotionally to you. And she's just like, one version of that is she's not interested in other people. But another version of that is there's fear underneath. So that's my point there. It masquerades.
Well, you introduce the reader to 3, I suppose, feelings or experiences that could be related to fear. Nothing feels enough. You've stopped trying, and your relationships are suffering. And those can be as a consequence of fear, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. And there are others beyond those, of course. But I think that when you start to the method I use in sort of the not good enough fear is like see it, face it, and replace it. And when you actually, when I'm asking somebody to really have a look at their fear, to stop long enough and find that little bit of courage to just peep under the covers and see what's really there. That's the kind of stuff that is telltale about how much fear is sitting around for you. And the question being, how is it in your way? This is not a benign emotion. This is not a benign energy. It absolutely steals from us. It absolutely is without intervention. It can take too much from us.
You mentioned see it, face it, replace it. Loved these steps. steps, and it sounds like it's a bit of a framework you might use when you sit down with people to help them overcome fears. And in fact, there are 3 or 4, 5 chapters in this section where obviously within the mask of confidentiality, you introduce your reader to some stories around helping people to deal with fear. But see it, face it, replace it. Can we go through these steps? So I loved see it, using images. I just described that as using images and metaphor to understand fear. It's like that, getting used to your sensory experience of fear. Tell us a little bit about seeing fear.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of image and working beyond the sort of cognitive when somebody's trying to uncover or explain or get a hold of how they feel and what they're experiencing. You know, it's kind of like if we only try and describe with language or, you know, with telling the story of our experience in one way, it's kind of like stuffing all of the material into a jar and putting the lid on, but there's stuff still running down the sides that we haven't caught. You know, that's the sort of tone and texture of that experience for someone. So I give some examples, you know, the story of Jake in the book, who was a footballer. Obviously, everybody in the book is de-identified.
Yes.
But the story of Jake, when it gets to the section of him describing, I'm trying to get him to describe his fear, you know, and how what he's feeling now. And he describes eventually, you know, he was resistant to the exercise and he's like, I hate this. And, you know, but eventually when he went there, he kind of exploded into imagery and which is generally what happens. And he said, well, okay, it's a big grizzly bear with, you know, chains, you know, shackled in chains, and the chains are chafing him and he hates it. And like, wow, suddenly, boom, you have a whole set of things to work with about what's going on for that person. You know, it's not just an angry, big, mean creature, you know, that somebody might look at on the surface, but it's chained, it's chafing, it's hurting, there's pain. And the image brought forth so much more to work with. And, you know, what I also love about it is it's his image, you know. I think it allows us just one other way to, you know, to allow description, not prescription, not kind of over-interpret what somebody's feeling or what somebody's experience is, because they own that image and they layer on, not me. And so, you know, it's so rich to work with. And I've found on many occasions that you can go, people, once they can open that imagination, and it does take that little step of courage or vulnerability, they can just go back to it. And you know, of course, what we know now is the unconscious plays much greater role than we imagined in our decision-making in our day-to-day waking life. It's not just this sort of thing kicking around in the background, it's in the driving seat a lot. So, you know, for me, using that image brings forth so much power into a conversation like that. So imagery is one way of doing it, but of course there are a number of other ways of uncovering, and I give some examples of questions in the book that people can use to sort of help bring forth what that how somebody's experiencing fear and what their fear is. Yeah.
You identify that, sorry, Pippa, you identify that under the face it section. So see it, face it, asking questions to go deeper into fear. And you list a whole bunch of questions in there. They're fantastic questions. I suppose my thought is there, do you get a bit of pushback from people who sort of say, well, I don't want to ask questions. I don't want to face my fear. I don't want to think about it, because if I think about it, surely I'm going to exacerbate it. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, of course, I definitely do. And it's when. The question is when and how, and, you know, at their pace, as I said earlier, you know, you meet people where they are. So, you know, if there is an agreement that fear is causing distress for the person, which is the first piece, right? Is when we can get around those ideas that it's a great motivator and I need it to be able to get through life and win. I need fear. I need it to be driving. When you can break down those falsities and build a different picture that there is stronger alternatives that don't cost you so much. You have to pay so much mental rent on that. Then you can come to that place of like, okay, well, let's have a little look at where you're at. Some people are, especially if I work with male athletes, or not just male athletes, but athletes who've been acculturated into tough, in their environments and in vulnerability, then sometimes this takes a little step. But I think if they know that they're in the lead and they're not like, okay, this is feeling too weird, but I also always explain why I'm doing this. I'll say this gives me, a bigger way of understanding. This lets me walk next to you and gives me a bigger way of understanding how we might find the alternatives to help you have a better path forward, a stronger path forward. So, when we talk in the face section, one of the things I'm trying to do most there is help somebody recognize the cost of the fear. So that's it. Again, we hold on to our ideas about toughing it out and about having to be bulletproof or invincible and all the other battle language, as we talked about before. We really hold tight to those examples or those archetypes. So when I can help somebody think about what the cost is, maybe they're getting through and getting their results on the scoreboard, but they've got, a litany of broken relationships around them, or they've really lost contact with their kids, or they're feeling a physical stress that's manifesting in some way in their body, or there's just many examples like, what does that amount of fear cost you? So I want to unpack that with the person in that section.
What I'm hearing you say and see it and face it is that people socially construct their world, or they construct their own world, and what you're trying to do as a psychologist is facilitate a process where this person's in charge and you're helping them, whether it's through images and metaphor, whether it's through questions, uncover what they're experiencing or broadening their feeling of their experience. And you mentioned earlier working through, so you'll work through coaches, and more as psychologists, we're sports psychologists, we're working out that ultimately we want to help the coaches. We want to work through the coaches. We want to help the coaches to help the athletes. And so my question there is, so you talk about images and metaphors, you talk about questions. If I go back to conversations, say, I've had with Professor Stephen Rolnick, motivational interviewing, Dr. Jonathan Fader, motivational interviewing on the Sports Psych show, and their wonderful work, and empathy is a big word in that world. Are you working through coaches? You want the coaches to be able to ask the right questions. You want the coaches to be able to put the player at the heart of the process of conversation. Does empathy enter this world at all?
Oh, so much. Yeah. Especially for the psych who's trying to help somebody walk through this journey. Fear is something we want to turn our back on and move away from, right? It's not a pleasant experience. So empathy, and empathy to the resistance, empathy to the I hate this stuff kind of comments, empathy to the this isn't relevant, that's all so important. You have to start a process of something like this, understanding that you're just an ally to the person who's doing the work. How am I an ally in this work? And you can't be an ally without empathy, and I think that's a brilliant word. I love it. It's a critical piece of any work where there's, and through the book, I talk also about shame. Shame is probably the ugliest, most, draining of our emotions. And fear and shame are very closely linked, as I talk about through the book. So, you can't do shame work if you can't bring empathy. So it's, if somebody's going to open up, what will they open up to? Empathy has to be absolutely central to that. And it's, so much of the best sports psychology work that we see, it comes down from the position of powerful expert, and walks next to with a set of ideas and tools as an ally. And I think that's just a critical piece.
To walk next to be an ally, do you think coaches should orientate themselves towards those kind of philosophies as opposed to traditional, I insist, I have the solution, I'm the fixer? Head more towards asking the questions, empathizing, in order to help create behavior change and or turning down the volume of fear?
There are moments, there is a difference, I think there are moments where authority really matters to turn down fear. Yeah. I want to make a distinction here.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're fearful, you want somebody else to take the reins, and you want them to be in charge, and you want to know that it's okay. So, the authority of the coach and the leader to say, this is what we're going to do. This is right. I trust you. You can do this, go get it. That's a really important distinction. So I just want to make that little carve out, in response before we talk about the philosophy as a whole.
Sure.
But a coach who can engage with the team, with the athlete, and that they can step down from expert power, and that they can step down into a position where they say, let's work out what the best outcome is. What are you, and questioning is the critical sort of feedback cycle in that, to be able to work out together. One of the things that gets in the way a lot is time. How much time, actual human one-to-one time, the coach spends with the athlete or athletes. Usually there's a technical focus or a tactical focus, and that time spent in partnership, thinking about how to get best possible outcome, is just so valuable. But I know it's a scarce resource in lots of ways. So, but I do think it's a powerful thing to do.
I have to see it and face it, it's replace it. It's changing the story, essentially. And I suppose when you put those three together, changing the story perhaps isn't just a case of changing the story. It does require good questions. It perhaps requires social support, empathy, if you like. It requires perhaps broadening the definition by using images and metaphor. But you ask the reader to look towards changing the story, and that neatly brings us on to part 4. And I'm mindful of your time, Pippa, so we won't dwell too long here, but needless to say, in part 4, replacing not good enough fears, so changing the story, you present the reader with a number of chapters where you talk about and emphasize anecdotes and stories about how to change their story, change fear into purpose, change fear or replace fear with surrender, with dreams and desires, with real connection, with laughter. Is there anything you'd like to share with the Sports Soap Show audience about that path, or replacing not good enough fears?
Really, what's in that section is a set of ideas and alternatives for people to explore. And each one of them is I feel has enough weight to topple fear as a sort of an orientation for your performance and for your life. If you take, for example, purpose, replace fear with purpose. Some amazing stories in that section, in particular Khalida Popal, the Afghani woman who basically had a very hard time in Afghanistan as a female footballer, wanting to be a female footballer, and what she took on and what she went through to get the first Afghani female women's team going. She had many occasions where she had some seriously valid reasons to be scared, to be afraid. But for her to have been able to step forward through her fear, she needed something more compelling than that to be her anchor. And she found that in, being, as she describes her purpose, being a voice for voiceless women. So, that was more compelling to her than staying scared, which would not allow her to head towards her purpose, to act according to something, she wanted to contribute beyond herself. So, there's many sort of stories like, with the dreams and desires with the magnificent Lee Spencer. We tend to have a narrative in contemporary society as head in the clouds. Dreamer's got his head in the clouds, or her head in the clouds. And, I'm a believer in dreams. I think they're very nutritious from a performance point of view. And his story is of being, knocked back many times and going through some adversity that most of us couldn't even, dream of. And how that was his fuel for his adventures and performance in life. How his dreams and the desire to go chase his dreams was his fuel. So there's these sets of ideas are sort of things that have enough weight that they can topple fear, enough reason to pull you in the opposite direction. And they vary. There's laughter is an example in there, and how and why laughter works in fear, in the moment fear, but also not good enough fear. And the most important one for me in all of them is real connection. The genuine power of decent relationships, strong relationships, and how that is probably the biggest fear tonic that we have.
Social support.
Yeah. But not just support, knowing that you have a safety net and somebody to go to, but a sense of connection, like real human to human connection, I think is just underrated still.
Pippa, fascinating stuff. I loved reading the book. It's definitely a book I'm going to go back to time and time again. And I know that the Sports Psych Show audience would be interested as to where they can purchase the book from. It's called Fearless, How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. Available in the usual channels?
Yeah, it's on Amazon or any of the other booksellers online. And for those people who can go into a bookstore, it's also at Waterstones. But that's been an unusual channel this year, hasn't it? Yeah, primary sources online at Amazon. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Pippa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great chat, and I'm really thrilled that your audience might get something out of this in terms of how they work with fear with their audiences too.
Absolutely. It's been a fantastic chat. I really enjoyed it. Well, everyone, that was Dr. Pippa Grange. I really, really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.